if people look at that and still feel resentment and anger, I think their mental state is the problem, and not the fact that someone has created wealth that actually makes their life better as well. We should really reinvestigate what we're doing with our tax and spend system. The fact that we're actually taxing profits and income and savings. I mean, those are the very things we want to encourage. It's like we're trying to punish people when they are doing exactly the kind of things we want. I've bet against him, not financially, but sort of when I've looked at the prospects of him being able to achieve the things he's talked about, with Tesla and electric cars, making a profit on that. I mean, no one has been able to do that.
Johan Norberg, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It seems that when you were young, you were quite the anti-industrialist and a leftist anarchist, I believe. What was it that put you on this entirely different path and led you to discover the ideas of classical liberalism and human progress?
Yeah, that's a good starting point, because I think that explains some of my obsession with human progress, the fact that I didn't used to believe in it. I used to think that modern civilization with industry and big business and international trade and large-scale infrastructure was sort of dark satanic mills, ruining traditional lifestyles and the unspoiled nature. So I wasn't very appreciative of modern institutions and economics. So what changed that? I think it was when I started reading history. I began to find that, I mean, the good old days weren't there. Whichever period I looked into, whatever country, it turned out that the past was a long series of misfortunes and deprivation and horror. And it turned out that my ancestors in Sweden, whom I had thought lived in this kind of nice, unspoiled nature, I hadn't thought of the real past. I had thought of it being like a nice excursion to the countryside, but still with sort of easily accessible calories and antibiotics and indoor plumbing and so on. The fact was that they turned out that they didn't live ecologically, they died ecologically at a young age. And I had to start to ask myself, where would I have been in this past? And probably nowhere, probably on the graveyard, because child mortality was roughly 50%. Life expectancy was around 30 years around the world 200 years ago. So I had to start to ask myself, what made the difference between that past and present day opportunities for most people in relatively open and free countries? And it turned out that all those institutions that I disliked, a modern cooperation, international trade, financial markets, and human freedom, that made the difference. And in that case, I had taken it all for granted. And I didn't appreciate it. And now what I do is a way of making up for that mistake in my past. And that made me very obsessed with thinking about such institutions, because they're not natural. They're not automatically there. They have to be created. They have to be defended. And that's what I'm doing now.
And now I think, you obviously like both of the aspects, right? You like the environment. And I feel like some people think that when we're pushing for capitalism and more growth, we're being like anti-environment, like we don't really care about the environment much. But obviously we do, because having a good environment, even if it's like created and improved upon by humans, we must first have that environment before for human flourishing to be possible in the first place. And obviously you have like an incredible background right here. So it seems like, you like both of the sides.
And that's an incredibly important point. My desperately poor ancestors, they couldn't have kept up a nice, decent, beautiful environment. They would have to use every resource to just make sure that they got heating and energy and food for the next day. Whereas the And that's the case everywhere where people are poor. They are forced to often make a choice between sort of their kids' education and decent access to food and resources, or to protect the environment short term. And that's not a real choice. That's a no-brainer. You're going to have to cut down the last tree if you need it for fuel. It's only when we get richer that we get both choices. We have more access to wealth, so we can make those choices. We also have science and technology that keeps on creating greener technologies that'll make it easier for us to both protect nature and protect humans.
Yep. People often use the word capitalism to describe something that they usually don't like, and usually it's something that's the result of the complete opposite of capitalism. If you could rebrand capitalism with another word that more effectively conveys the economic system, what would it be?
I've thought about that quite a lot, because I'm not very happy with the word capitalism. To most people, it sounds like it's the rule of capital. It's the rule of those who have the most resources. Whereas in my mind, it's quite the opposite. Someone will always control resources. Who is it going to be? Well, in all previous systems, it's someone at the top. It's the king, the emperor, the slave owner, the feudal lords. Capitalism is the first system that takes the power away from those centralized institutions and decentralize control to millions and millions of people, summarized by sort of words like markets and free exchange between people. So capitalism is not a perfect word. So why do I use it? I use it because others use it all the time, and often the opponents. And I think that once in a while we need a book from someone who actually defends the system of free market capitalism, using that word when people are looking for a book on capitalism. But if I could choose, I mean, I like Deirdre McCloskey's word innovism, a great economist and historian. She thinks that that's what it's about, creating something new constantly and innovating. But unfortunately, it doesn't really take off. A word that's closer to taking off and summarizes the system is markets, free markets. I think that's it's what it says on the tin. It's people allowed to engage voluntarily, cooperating and exchanging voluntarily with one another. That's what it's about. But just like capitalism, it sounds a little bit sterile. It sounds like it's more about markets than humans. We have to explain that markets is what we are doing, we humans, when we're free to do it. But perhaps at least it's better than capitalism. Do you have an alternative? I'm open to suggestions.
I don't know. When I think of it, I just think of the word freedom, right? Like freedom of exchange, free markets, as you said. But yeah, like when you, I don't know, but socialists, communists, like they often like say people over profits, but like it's not a dichotomy, right? Profits are proof of service, and if you're not meeting the needs of the people, you're not earning a profit on the free market. So I think, yeah, that definitely needs explaining for some reason. But why do you think even centuries after these ideas have been brutally refuted, people still hold them to be true and desire more, regulation, more intervention, less freedom?
Yeah, that keeps surprising me. But I think it's because fictional socialism will always be superior to real world capitalism. So as long as you're allowed to sort of come up and sort of dream up new systems without any relationship to reality, it will always look better than the real world implications of any system. And I think that the left and socialists, they're not very good economists, really, but they're very good when it comes to poetry and envisioning other systems where they take out, just like I did before I realized the value of the modern economy. I dreamt about how it could be, how it could take off some of the sharp elbows from our modern system, some of the ugliness, some of the environmental destruction, and yet thinking that we could keep all the wealth and keep growing and keep creating all those innovations that protect humanity and life, that will always seem better. And I think there will always be new generations who haven't experienced real world big government, who will always look at the system we're having, and it's rarely perfect. And I have my doubts about many aspects of it as well. There's room for improvement, but there will always then be room for new generations to dream about how it could be entirely different, as long as they don't have to make the difficult decisions and the trade-offs that are involved in modern economics. And that's why we often get this, the system of, whenever someone says he's a socialist and redistributes, consumes all the resources, it's always a honeymoon. People think it's great, it's fantastic. And then we enter step two. It's the excuses. In the Soviet Union, they apparently had bad weather for 70 years or something like that, because the crops always failed and the production didn't work out. And that's, or North Korea or Venezuela, misfortune, wrong people ended up at the top and so on. So it's not really their fault. And then the third step is usually it's not real, that was not real socialism phase. When people say, oh, that was nothing like what I had in mind, because my idea of socialism is that it'll turn out great and people will care for one another and we'll all have enough to eat and it'll be a very free society. So the Soviet Union or Mao's China or Cuba or Venezuela wasn't real socialism. That's more like state capitalism. I'm envisioning something else, a fictional socialism where everything's great. And in that case, they'll always, because they can always move on to the next step, go to the first phase, finding someone else who will dream about something else. So you have to walk people through all the empirical data and all the historical statistics to show it. It's not enough to dream.
Which you do beautifully in your books. I actually had Per Byland on my podcast, and he said something similar, which is, if you think about religions, right, like the end goal is sort of to reach heaven and the state where everything is in abundance, and people sort of desire that here on earth, and they're like, and that is just sort of proof of time preference, right? Like, why can't I have it right now? But yeah, just this idea that poverty is something that is created, and that we need poverty alleviation programs, which is essentially propaganda for wealth redistribution. But people making this argument, like, they forget that poverty is the default state of mankind, and wealth is created. That's the anomaly, and that's what needs explaining, not poverty. You wrote a great tweet where you said, 8 people are richer than 3.6 billion, says Oxfam. So my daughter, who has $20, is richer than 2 billion. So the problem is poverty, not inequality. Some people would still say that, even if people have gotten out of poverty, there's a psychological issue here where people will always compare themselves to someone richer than them and feel envious. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah, that might be the case. I've certainly noticed that there's some envy out in the world historically and in present-day societies. But also, obviously, yes, you can look at something that others have and you can react in 2 different ways. When you think that you want the same, you can think about resentment, thinking, why doesn't I have the same thing? Why should they have it? And you can vote for someone who takes away parts of it from them. Or you can try to go through let your mind walk through the operations. How did they get there? How did they end up being rich? And there are 2 different ways. They might have stolen it from someone. They might have taken it. They could be crony capitalists who got it in subsidies or tariff protection because they're friends with the government, and that's a bad thing, and we should be opposed to that. But if they got it on a free market, on a relatively free market, it's because they provided others with something that they appreciate more than the money that they handed over to them. So, as you said earlier, profit is a proof of service to somebody else on a free market. So, if you end up with a large fortune in that case, it means that you've taken a risk, you've started a project, you've invested in goods, services, a business model, and then you have to obviously pay your employees, your workers, whether it works out or not, even if your product never sells. And you have to pay for suppliers, for all the supplies and inputs and natural resources you got. You have to pay, if you have a loan, you have to pay interest on that loan. And then obviously you're going to have to sell the product, the service, and make somebody else happy. If you manage to do all these four groups happy, you make the workers happy, the consumers, those who lend you money, and the suppliers. If you make all of them happy and yet keep something afterwards, that's your profit, which will obviously be heavily taxed. That's the profit. It's not something that you've taken away from somebody else. It's not a reason to feel resentment. It's the little. It's not something you take away from others. It's the little share that you get to keep of the value that you've created for others. And in that case, the greater your profit, the better it is, because you've made even more people happy. That's how we get out of poverty. That is, as you rightly point out, the default state of humanity. Only if we get more people to be successful like that in creating wealth, win-win-win situations, whereby not only your closest sort of associates, partners, and consumers get happy, but the whole of society, because you increase wealth and technological capacity. Only then do we create a better life for more people. So if people look at that and still feel resentment and anger, I think their mental state is the problem, and not the fact that someone has created wealth that actually makes their life better as well.
Yeah, I think the entrepreneurs are really heroes. Actually, even though they get so much flack for making other people's lives better, and the only way they earn profits, as you pointed out, is like they create value, and people willingly purchase their products, not through coercion. That's the government and the state, and you can't opt out of their services. But with entrepreneurs, you can always opt out of their services, but you're buying stuff that you want, and they're giving you a service, and their profit is a proof of service, and that gets taxed. And firstly, they get obviously financially taxed by the government, which, as I think Mises said, like when you're taxing higher profits, you're basically encouraging waste, right? Like anything that you tax is like basically what you want less of, right? And so if you're taxing profits, you're like, no, I want the opposite of profits, which is like wasting, like losses. And it's like, firstly, so there's the financial side of aspect of it, but then even society, like people just there's so much like psychological pressure, I guess, to these entrepreneurs who like constantly are called out as greedy and like just profit driven. They don't care about people, but they have to care about people to actually give you the products that you want.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, we should really reinvestigate what we're doing with our tax and spend system. The fact that we're actually taxing profits and income and savings. I mean, those are the very things we want to encourage. It's like we're trying to punish people when they are doing exactly the kind of things we want. I mean, there's a reason why governments tax, pollution and cigarettes. It's because they don't like pollution and cigarettes, and they want less of it. So in that case, and that at least sort of makes sense. But why in that case are we taxing people when they're working, saving, taking risks, and making a profit? It's the same logic. We're ruining it.
People have this romanticized view of the past, right? Like we were just talking about. And it's usually before industrialization, and that those were the good old days. And look at us evil humans now destroying the planet, more stressed than ever, constantly just chasing growth. One of Spain's top-ranked universities now has a master's program in degrowth. I wonder who's going to hire anyone with a degree in degrowth. Even the people who want degrowth aren't willing to start loss-making businesses, right? Why do you think there's a growing academic interest in degrowth? And maybe just talk a little bit about the fall of Western universities.
Yeah, this is the exhibit A in the fall of Western education, I think. Why are people interested in degrowth? I think it's kind of like Ayn Rand, the Russian novelist and philosopher, once put it. Socialists once said that, look, with our system, we'll produce more and cheaper shoes for everyone, so everyone will afford shoes. And then it turns out that the system failed in producing shoes. So they changed their mind and said, oh no, socialism is superior because it's better to walk barefoot. So they keep on sort of, how do you always hit the target? Well, whenever you miss, you call what you've hit the target. You sort of paint the target around what you hit. And I think that's the case with degrowth. In a way, it's been difficult for the interventionists to create growth and rich societies. So that has created a momentum for people saying that, but why? What is it good for? Growth. It'll make us stressed out and we'll become materialist, consumerist, and we'll ruin the planet in the process. And that creates this degrowth movement. And of course, there are some real and serious environmental concerns as well. The fact that when we're doing things, we will obviously have an impact on the world. And in the short term, that can be bad for the environment. And those two trends coalesce into what I think is the most stupid idea that has been developed by smart people, namely degrowth, thinking that the world would be a better place if we're not creating more. And you know, they think that they're saying that growth is just more stuff, but it's really not. This is growth, being able to have be so efficient and have so much capital and ideas mixed into every operation that we're doing, so that we become more productive as a society, so that we get more leisure time, so that we'll get more purchasing power, so that we can actually do something else than working all the time to just stay alive. That's the reason why we can sit here and talk about capitalism, socialism, and degrowth, something that only a few people in the richest elite could do in every past society. So they don't understand what growth is about. But I think there's a more difficult problem there as well, when they think that the solution to environmental problem is to just do less, produce less, travel less, trade less. And it would be a disaster for mankind, because standing still is, then we revert to the default stage, which is poverty. But it's also awful for the environment. And that's something that I think that they haven't really looked into. Because which societies have managed to clean up their mess? The richest and most technologically sophisticated countries on the planet are doing the most when it comes to reducing pollution, cleaning up the rivers and lakes, and protecting wildlife, improving agricultural productivity. You might even hear my neighbor's tractor out there, diesel tractor, which might seem environmentally bad, but it's made it possible for him to produce more food on a smaller plot, which means that we can leave more to wildlife and biological diversity, and so on and so on. The worst environmental problem is really a lack of technological capacity, because in that case we're going to have to use everything, every resource, just to stay alive. And to me, one perfect illustration, an unfortunate illustration of this, was the pandemic. If you think that degrowth is the solution to global warming, then the pandemic was your perfect example. You should be able to point to the pandemic and say, that's what we're going to do, because suddenly people were forced to stay at home. They weren't allowed to go to work. We blocked, not a single airplane took off. So we really had reverted back to degrowth. And that was obviously a disaster for mankind. Over a single year, 70 million people were thrown into poverty. But more than that, it didn't help the planet one bit. On the contrary, I mean, it only reduced carbon dioxide emission during the first pandemic year by 6%, no more than 6%, which means that if we were to just reach the Paris Climate Accords by doing less, we would need something like a pandemic every year until 2030, without any rebound in between, which would obviously be a nightmare for humanity and then their life and health. But it won't help us with the environment. It'll help us with one particular bit of it, no carbon dioxide. But should we do then to grow our food and create our the kind of things that we need? Well, we would need to use the resources that are there. We won't be able to create new and better and smarter ways of creating resources in an environmentally friendly way. So, yeah, no, degrowth, really, sorry, it gets me going. It's such an awful idea.
Yeah, towards the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about people often blaming capitalism for the faults of the government, and I think one great example of this is this growing consumerism, right? That people often think, oh, like people are buying all these things they don't need to like impress people they don't even know, but like. So firstly, I think the word need is often abused, right? Like who decides what you need? And also like the reason like people are the reason for like this growing just like constantly buying stuff is a higher time preference, which I think is the result of government meddling with money and interest rates.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's important to really go back to first principles there. So yes, you're right. What do we need? Well, there are some obvious sort of physical needs we all have, but apart from that, we continue to climb the hierarchy of needs. And when we're able to stay alive, it's about community, and it's about identity, and it's about fulfilling our own personal ambitions. And they differ because we are different as individuals. And the needs of others, what they think they need, will always look strange and weird and unnecessary to me. I don't get why the neighbors need to spend all their time with their garden. Why is that so important to them? They will never understand why I buy new books all the time, and why I think it's important to read about sort of the story of Abbasid Baghdad. And some of my closest friends don't understand that, and I don't understand their taste in music or clothes or what have you. And isn't that wonderful? Isn't that one of the best aspects of a modern free society? That we're able to live in a world where people are free to indulge in their weird ways of fulfilling their personal needs and ambitions and interests in that way, because that gives it gives you the right to do the same thing. Most people would think that we're weird who spend our days doing Zoom interviews about capitalism and what is a human need. I mean, that's more extraordinary than some of the sort of travel needs and consumer needs.
Try explaining that to a caveman. Like we're sitting miles apart, like thousands of miles apart, and conducting this interview. Like I'm able to talk to you. Like the caveman didn't need this thing, right? Like the conception of needs for the caveman was completely different to what even it is today. Like they didn't have vaccines either, and vaccines are a great thing. And now like people expect free healthcare, which is like a whole different thing. But yeah,
exactly. So I think that it's important to challenge that idea about, because there's always somebody else who's unnecessary, right? And their way of creating a life for themselves. We look upon that, and especially intellectuals look upon that, and they don't understand. Because, we're intellectuals, you and I. It's difficult to understand how people can be intellectually satisfied with a life of sort of, going to the mall and buying cheap stuff. I don't get it. They should be sitting here talking about the cavemen and the Roman Empire. I mean, and therefore it's so easy for intellectuals when they make policy to say that their life is unimportant, undignified, without meaning. It should be more important, and they should basically live more like we do. And that's just the basic conceit of people who can't see that the world is so much richer and bigger than can fit into their own little mind. And so that's important to push back on.
Yeah, completely. Some people question, like, how can you have infinite growth on a finite planet? But you've said, quote, if growth was only created when more things were put into the pot, there would obviously be limits to growth. But only our imagination and our freedom set the limits for what recipes we can come up with. end quote. I think you were referring to Paul Romer's analogy of cooking. It's not that we're just doing more and more of the same kind of cooking, but we invent new recipes. So the future really is open-ended, and we don't have to worry about we don't have to slow down and worry about reaching any limits to growth. If anything, we should solve our problems faster and make progress even more quicker.
Absolutely. Again, we're back to this problem that people often assume that growth is just sort of a bigger pile of stuff, and it'll take more resources and more energy to produce it every day. Yes, there will be limits to that in that case, but that's not what we're doing. We're trying to come up with a better way of meeting our needs and demands, and that recipe then often takes fewer resources than it took before, because classical example is, of course, the soda can. The fact that a soda can used to have 5 times more metal in it, but by coming up with ingenious wrappings and better materials, we've been able to reduce the walls of the can by 4/5, and we're doing that everywhere, in every part of production and of distribution. The digital revolution is, of course, an example of that. The fact that my cell phone used to take sort of a radio, maps. I used to have we used to have piles of books with a phone number to every person in our city and our country. We had to have a stereo. We sort of lots of stuff that are now just ones and zeros in a digital system. We're doing that again and again. And in fact, when you look at how we're using resources, McAfee's book, right? I should remember his name, but it's, sorry, I'm going to have to credit him with this point, so I'm going to have to. Oh, it's Andrew McAfee's book, More from Less. And this is related to, the superabundance work of my Cato colleague, Marian Tupy and Gail Pooley, who are constantly writing about how we're able to get more from less resources. And the latest US Geological Survey shows that the use of 66 of the 72 resources that are most, of the 66 of 72 resources, important enough to be documented in the US Geological Survey, our use of them has declined in recent decades in the US. So America is actually using less, steel, stone, aluminium, nickel, copper, wood, paper every year to produce the goods, the services that we need. That's what you get in a competitive and an innovative environment where people are constantly trying to come up with new solutions to old problems.
Yeah. I first came across your work, specifically your book, The Capitalist Manifesto, through Elon Musk on X. It seems like he's a big fan of your work, and I know you interviewed him recently as well. What do you think about Elon Musk?
I think he's the kind of entrepreneurial hero that changes the world. The kind of people who, Steve Jobs talked about in an old Apple advert, as the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are usually the ones who do. And, I've bet against him, not financially, but sort of when I've looked at the prospects of him being able to achieve the things he's talked about, to Tesla and electric cars, making a profit on that. No one has been able to do that. And then again, with SpaceX being able to sort of outcompete the big businesses who had all those fancy contracts with NASA in the US, and now he's managed again and again, and recently with a spaceship soft landing on the Indian Ocean. It's incredible the things that he's done against steep odds again and again. And I think he's a great case of sort of entrepreneurial success against the bets of smart people.
Yeah. I think, as Peter Thiel says, the first rule is to never bet against Elon. Javier Milei also spoke at that same conference where he interviewed Elon Musk. The media in the West often portrays him as this crazy Trump populist, and you made a great joke about him not combing his hair every morning, but leaving it to the invisible hand to sort it out. How do you view his policies and his work in Argentina so far?
Yeah, he is an eccentric guy with an eccentric haircut, and sometimes, his aggressive rhetoric stands in the way of at least the rest of the world understanding what he's about. Apparently, the Argentinians seem to like it. But I think it's important to point out that despite him being eccentric and having this weird rhetoric, to me, he seems like the opposite of a Donald Trump character, who's only sort of in it for his own ego and his own power hunger. And if he's got a principle, it's some sort of nativist, protectionist attitude, and the rest of can be damned. Javier Milei is the complete opposite. He's this kind of he's got a very classical liberal economic approach, which involves a very cosmopolitan free trade approach to the world, and very much in favor of not admiring dictators, but on the contrary, uniting against the Russias and the Chinas of the world to create a safe space for progress and openness on this planet. So I'm very interested in seeing how this is going to work out. I think his plan for Argentina's economy is incredibly important, and it seems well thought through. And the way he's going about things, he's managed to combine a radical understanding of what it takes to change it with a pragmatic approach to how to get this through a parliament where he doesn't have a majority. And I mean, it's difficult to say as an outsider, but when I was in Buenos Aires and I met his team and so on, it seems like they're much more clever in implementing these reforms than the rest of the world give them credit for. And so far, he surprised people. I think that he surprised economists abroad. He surprised the International Monetary Fund by being able to actually turn the chronic budget deficit into surplus. Might be a short surplus, but I mean, that's the first time in like 2 decades, something like that. And inflation has been declining every month since he took power, which is an incredible achievement since Argentina was going towards a hyperinflation. So I think he's doing the right things. Will he manage? It's a tricky process. Argentina is so heavily into debt that any slight disturbance could turn this into a government default, and it could turn into a very nasty process, especially since many of his reforms will be blocked by a very angry radical Peronist opposition who didn't manage to beat him at the polls at the elections, but they tried to stop him in the streets and block further progress. And if they manage to stop the country, there might be this problem that we're stuck in between, in a moment when it takes very sharp austerity and budget cuts to just sort of stabilize the situation. But we also then need the structural reforms to get businesses to start to invest, get capital flowing again, and build new businesses and expand jobs so that we get out of that short-term recession. Well, if the Peronists manage to stop it in between, we might be frozen in the recession part of it, and that would end in tears, and Argentina would get back into the stagnation of the past 80 years, basically. And we have to remind ourselves that again, 100 years ago, Swedes looked to Argentina as this incredibly wealthy country, one of the richest countries on the planet, richer than Sweden, and people like our most famous bard, troubadour, Evert Taube, he went there and this is the country of the future. But then, unfortunately, they took their wealth for granted and began to redistribute resources and stop international trade. And the result has been one of the few countries on the planet that turned wealth, being a wealthy country, decided to become a poor country, basically.
Yeah, I'm definitely rooting for him and Argentina. Do you think law enforcement, production, and adjudication can, in principle, be executed better by private firms than by the government? Or do you envision an ideal world with that includes an entity that has a monopoly on violence?
Yeah, I think that every single aspect of enforcing the rules that we've decided upon and the courts have decided upon can probably be done better if there's competition between various providers, for sure, rather than monopolies. So I can clearly see uh, something there, and that's obviously a reason why we have so much private security. Often they're better and more efficient than the official police in lots of places. But I can't see a situation where we have competition over the rules between different courts. Well, we do. Obviously, we have different courts and we transfer the decision to the next level and so on. But there has to be a point at which, when that highest Supreme Court says that this is the rule, we can't have competition between that and another court saying something else. And it's up to you to decide what you're into, because then it's not competition in providing services, it's competition between who has the most force, basically, who has the biggest guns. And that, I would say, I mean, I've read some market anarchists who've come up with ingenious solutions on how to deal with this and why it would be in everybody's interest to come up with a system that works. But I have yet to understand how this would work in a real world when force hangs in the balance. I guess I've seen too much of history to be interested in experimenting with that and hoping that it would work out well. So no, there's got to be a point where you have a monopoly on the decision on who gets to use force for what.
Interesting. But don't you think, like, historically rules have been formed from the ground up? Like, they're not like, the reason they're they're a top-down authority is able to enforce them is because, like, they were formed from the ground up, like money, right? Like it's similar to money.
That's absolutely the case. You're absolutely right. And some of the most important developments in law were obviously the result of people coming together and sometimes almost without any plan, coming up with a system of rules that works for them. And smart systems of rules come from that, whereas those who've just been designed from the top are often quite useless and oppressive. So I agree on that. A good system of law recognizes those rules, laws rather than legislation, as Hayek would put it. But when we have in the end, a decision on and people's minds are opposite and diverse, and different decisions on who gets to use a certain resources, who gets to use force against whom, well, then I think we need someone who has the sort of has managed to close the issue and say, that's it, you're not allowed to sort of attack one another to see who's right. Would people be able to sort it out by themselves? Yeah, sure. And in that case, they can do that. But if they can't, I would very much want a last word rather than what seems more like civil war rather than competition.
I want to read a beautiful quote from your book, The Capitalist Manifesto, where you say, "The uniqueness of the free market is revealed every time you arrive at the counter and pay for your coffee. You say thank you, and the cashier answers with a thank you. We hear such strange double thank yous in all marketplaces, from the square where we buy our vegetables and the restaurant where we pay the bill to the meeting room where a contract is written with a supplier. It is not a thank you followed by a you're welcome or yes sir. It is a thank you that is answered with a thank you, for each party has done the other a favor. This mutual gratitude is the sign that you have created value for someone else, and the potential profit you make is proof that you have produced goods and services that people are willing to pay more than is required for just the raw materials, technology, and working time required to create it. Critics of capitalism often argue that one party is being exploited in a transaction that they don't approve of, even if it doesn't violate their property rights in any way. For example, children are often discouraged legally from working, even if it's consensual between the child and the employer. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on children or teenagers working voluntarily. My hot take is that labor unions have an incentive to argue against child labor because it increases competition for their adult employees, but it may be too simplistic.
Yeah, no, there's something to that. I mean, the basic principle is incredibly important. I mean, if two people thank one another, it means that both have done the other a favor, and that's a great thing. And why should a third party be allowed to interfere and say, I don't like the exchange that you've done here, so I'm going to stop you? That's the most arrogant approach to the world and to your fellow human being that you can think of. And yet, this is how much of politics and much of trade unions activity, what it's all about. So we should avoid that. However, it means that you would have to be the people entering this agreement should have at least a minimum of human agency and rationality. There are people who might be exploited because they don't understand what they've entered into. So there's a room, I think, to protect people who are too young or who aren't cognitively developed to understand what they're going into, at least to make sure that we have a procedure whereby we help them to understand what this is about and the long-term implications. That's fine. So how does this go, for example, when it comes to how does this apply to children? When I think that there are some aspects of work that might be too heavy, too hazardous, to being too physically destructive long term, it might stifle their development long term, and we might have a reasonable interest to protect them against that. And obviously, that's what we're doing as parents when we stop children from engaging into risky behavior. Historically, we've had child labor in every society for the simple reason that everybody needed all hands on deck. Children had to be involved in agriculture and in sort of household chores because they couldn't do away with the work of children. Others wanted to stop that. I think it's often a combination of, just like Baptists and bootleggers are both interested in banning alcohol. It's both those who don't like alcohol and those who want to supply it on the black market. We see the same thing with child labor historically, often missionaries who wanted to protect children, but also those who had an interest in stopping others from competing with their work. I think that historically bans that, why did child labor decline? We can see this in every society, basically. It became an issue only under the Industrial Revolution, not because work was so much worse back then, but because it became visible in a period when people's wealth was growing. So parents could suddenly invest in their children's future instead and giving them an education so that their long-term incomes would be better. They could sort of skip the wages and the work of kids short term, and they'll get a larger payoff later because of it. And this happens in every society as it gets richer, and that's a very natural and good, decent development. What happens if you ban child labor before countries have reached that stage is that you don't help those families or those kids because families still rely on their work. In the worst case, it means that you don't have enough hands in agriculture and people begin to starve. And oftentimes it means that they work in the informal sector instead. We have many awful cases of that, with kids turning to crime, to child prostitution, because they're desperate for any kind of income. So it's important that this transition is as sort of natural and organic as possible, and not as a way of second guessing families' decision, because they are often, not always, but they're often the best, have the most knowledge of their individual situation.
Yeah, completely agree. Final question. What would you say to someone who's young, perhaps in their 20s, and thinks that the world is falling apart as evil humans are destroying Mother Nature? The only way out of this is to slow down progress. How do you help them think more optimistically about the future and realize that we don't have to stop growing?
I think you'd want them, I mean, when they care about specifics, it could be sort of our impact on nature, pollution, or it could be sort of the state of food security around the world. If you have time, I'd ask them to look into all those cases. Where has progress been made, and how did that happen? What they'll often see is that only wealthy and technologically advanced societies who've left lots of room for entrepreneurs and innovators to come up with smart new solutions are the ones who are making that progress. If you're really interested in the issues, don't just complain and whine about it. Look at where we've managed to create solutions. I mean, half of the world's population lived in chronic undernourishment 70 years ago. Now we're down into almost single digits. And how did that happen? How did that come about? And often the answer is not romantic. It's about sort of better crops and artificial fertilizer and bigger tractors and better irrigation systems. Look at where that happened. Who came up with it? Where was it implemented and applied? And that'll give people both a more optimistic approach to the world, but also that'll be a lesson in capitalism as well, because only innovative societies manage to do that big time. If they don't have that time and patience, I just ask them to read history, read a history book. Think about where you would have been in any other society historically. If you had a time machine and could go back in the past, where would you go? And what would be the life expectancy, the child mortality, the food insecurity, the state of dentistry? If you had a bad tooth, what would happen if you needed surgery without anesthesia? I mean, without ways of sterilizing the equipment and so on. That's more of a shock treatment if you're a pessimist, sort of thinking that we're ruining the planet now. Well, look to the past and try to name one single place where you would rather end up in that time machine than here and now, or possibly in the future.
Well, Johan, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate your time. Highly recommend people read all of your books, and yeah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure.